Ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at a historic crossroads where diplomacy, courage, and national pride converge. India has given a bold and uncompromising reply that has left Pakistan and Saudi Arabia in shock. This reply is not just about words, it is about power, vision, and the determination to defend our sovereignty. For decades, India has tolerated baseless allegations, interference, and constant attempts to undermine its global rise. But today, the India of 2025 is not the India of the past. We no longer bow down, we no longer remain silent, and we no longer tolerate hypocrisy on the international stage. Pakistan, a country that thrives on exporting terror and blaming others for its failures, tried once again to corner India on fabricated narratives. Saudi Arabia, joining the quarter, underestimated India's voice, thinking it could pressure us by aligning with outdated geopolitics. But the reply they received was firm, fearless, and unforgettable. India made it clear: we are not a nation to be lectured on peace by those who have funded extremism. We are not a country to be cornered by those whose economies and politics depend on manipulating global alliances. And we are not the power to be ignored anymore. This reply shocked the world because it was a reminder. India is not just a regional power. India is a rising global leader, a leader that speaks truth to power, challenges hypocrisy, and protects its national interest with unmatched resolve. India's new identity is rooted in strength, confidence, and the ability to shape global narratives, rather than merely react to them. For decades, India was often seen as a nation that spoke softly, a country that chose silence over confrontation and compromise over clarity. That image has now transformed into something far more powerful. And this transformation is exactly what shocked Pakistan and Saudi Arabia when India delivered its bold reply. The India of 2025 is not the hesitant India of the past. It is a nation that stands tall, speaks directly, and refuses to be dictated to by anyone, no matter how powerful they may appear. This new identity is not built overnight. It is the result of consistent economic growth, military modernization, diplomatic outreach, and most importantly, the awakening of national consciousness among its people and leaders. When India replied boldly, it was not just a political statement, but the voice of 1.4 billion people declaring that they will not allow their nation to be undermined any longer. The shock value of India's reply lies in its tone and delivery. In previous decades, India often tried to maintain balance, choosing to downplay confrontations for the sake of global harmony. That approach, while diplomatic, often allowed countries like Pakistan to spread propaganda and for powers like Saudi Arabia to underestimate India's resolve. This time, however, India's response was not cautious. It was sharp, unflinching, and uncompromising. This is the identity of a nation that has realized its place in the New World Order. India is not just a regional voice confined to South Asia, but a rising power whose words carry weight in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, and beyond. The confidence with which India replied stunned its opponents, because it proved that the days of India being cornered or silenced are over. This new identity is also backed by tangible achievements.
India today is the fastest growing major economy, a technology hub and a military power with global reach. Its partnerships with the United States, Europe, Japan, and even African nations have given it leverage that it never had before. This leverage is the backbone of its confidence. When India speaks now, it does so not from a position of weakness or dependency, but from strength and independence. The boldness of the reply shocked Pakistan because it had grown accustomed to painting India as an aggressor without expecting a counter-narrative that could dismantle its lies in front of the world. Similarly, Saudi Arabia, which had assumed its influence in global energy and Islamic politics, gave it leverage over India, was stunned to see India respond with unshaken firmness, reminding them that influence works both ways and respect must be mutual.
India's new identity is also psychological. It represents a nation that has shed the inferiority complex of being colonized for centuries. It is the voice of a nation that is no longer defined by foreign narratives, but by its own values and ambitions. This psychological transformation is what makes India's reply resonate globally. The message was not just aimed at Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, it was a signal to the entire world that India demands to be treated with respect. This identity refuses to accept double standards. For years, India tolerated lectures on human rights and peace from nations that themselves have questionable records. But today, India confronts such hypocrisy directly, exposing the contradictions without fear. The reply that shocked Pakistan and Saudi Arabia was the clearest demonstration of this identity shift. It was bold, not because it was aggressive, but because it was unapologetically honest. India has learned that global power respects strength, not silence. In a world where perception defines influence, India has carefully crafted its new image. A nation that is proud, powerful, and prepared to defend its interests with words as well as action. This is why the bold reply sent shockwave. It was not just what India said, but the way it said it, with authority, confidence, and clarity that made the world take notice. This new identity ensures that India is no longer a passive participant in global affairs, but a decisive force that others must reckon with. When India gave its bold reply, one of the most striking elements was how it directly exposed Pakistan's long history of terror politics on the global stage. For decades, Pakistan has attempted to hide behind rhetoric, presenting itself as a victim of global conflict, while quietly fueling extremism across the region. India, however, did not hold back this time. It reminded the world that Pakistan's narrative of victimhood is nothing but a mask designed to cover its own complicity in terrorism. This boldness shook Pakistan because it was no longer dealing with an India that tiptoed around the truth. Instead, it faced a confident and unapologetic India that placed the mirror of reality before the international community, forcing everyone to see Pakistan for what it truly is. Pakistan has consistently used a tool of terror as an extension of its foreign policy. From supporting extremist groups in Kashmir to providing safe havens for organizations that the world recognizes as terrorist entities, its track record speaks volumes. Yet for years, Islamabad managed to deflect blame by cleverly portraying itself as a frontline state in the so-called war on terror. India, in its bold reply, stripped away that facade by pointing out undeniable facts. Terrorist leaders have found shelter in Pakistan. Funding networks for extremism operate openly there, and the Pakistani state apparatus has either turned a blind eye or actively supported such activity. By making this direct accusation without hesitation, India dismantled Pakistan's ability to twist the narrative and force the international community to confront an uncomfortable truth. The shock in Pakistan came from the tone of finality in India's words. There was no room left for denial or excuses. In the past, India's responses often carried a tone of diplomatic restraint, preferring not to escalate tensions by being too direct. This time, the reply was precise and unwavering. leaving no doubt that India had lost patience with the lies. It was not just a rebuttal, it was an exposure. By placing Pakistan's terror politics in the spotlight, India not only defended itself, but also aligned with the concerns of many other nations that have suffered due to extremist networks rooted in Pakistan. This bold move placed Pakistan in an even more isolated position as it struggled to counter facts with empty rhetoric. The reply also carried weight because it came at a time when the world is increasingly unwilling to tolerate double standards regarding terrorism. India seized this moment to remind global powers that selective outrage cannot continue. While Pakistan has tried to weaponize international platforms like the UN to attack India, India turned the tables by presenting evidence and examples that highlighted Pakistan's duplicity. This was a devastating blow to Pakistan's strategy because it exposed the reality that its narrative is unsustainable when confronted with facts. The international community, hearing India's strong words, could no longer ignore the role Islamabad has played in destabilizing not only South Asia, but also global security. What added to the shock was India's refusal to soften its language for diplomatic courtesy. India's reply carried the weight of conviction, making it clear that this was not a temporary accusation, but a firm stance. It sent a message that India is not interested in polite debates, when lives are at stake and when terror threatens the safety of its people. This clarity is what rattled Pakistan the most. For years it had relied on India's softer tone to continue spinning its lies. But this new India has cut through that illusion. The firmness of the reply demonstrated to the world that India will no longer allow Pakistan to play the victim, while exporting violence. By exposing Pakistan's terror politics so openly, India also gained a moral advantage on the world stage. The global community respects nations that stand for truth, and India's rep positioned it as a voice of reason and justice. This made Pakistan appear weaker, cornered and defensive. Instead of being able to attack India, Pakistan suddenly found itself in the dock, forced to explain its own record. That reversal of roles is what shocked Islamabad most deeply. The boldness of India's words has created a shift in perception, where Pakistan is increasingly seen not as a victim, but as an instigator of terror. This exposure was not just a reply, it was a revelation, and it has left a lasting mark on international opinion. Saudi Arabia's miscalculation in underestimating India's boldness became one of the most shocking aspects of the reply that reverberated across the world. For decades, Saudi Arabia has enjoyed immense influence in global affairs due to its economic power, control over oil markets, and its position as the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam. These strengths gave Riyadh a sense of authority and leverage over many nations, including India in the past. But in the new global order of 2025, India is no longer the nation that bends under pressure, and Saudi Arabia learned that lesson the hard way. The bold reply India delivered was a firm reminder that economic power or religious influence cannot be used as tools to dictate terms to a rising superpower that now commands its own place on the global stage. The miscalculation of Saudi Arabia stemmed from its assumption that India would respond to criticism with restraint or careful diplomacy, as it often did in previous decades. Riyadh believed that its weight in the energy market and its influence in the wider Islamic world would give it an edge in framing narratives against India, especially on sensitive issues. However, the reply from India shattered those assumptions. India made it clear that respect must be mutual and that no country, regardless of its wealth or status, could expect to interfere in India's sovereignty or internal matters without facing a strong, direct, and uncompromising response. This rejection of intimidation shocked Saudi Arabia because it had expected compliance or silence, not resistance. India's reply also highlighted the fact that the global economic landscape has shifted dramatically. While oil once gave Saudi Arabia unrivaled leverage, the diversification of energy sources and India's pursuit of renewable energy have reduced that influence. India, as one of the fastest growing economies, has positioned itself as a buyer with options, not as a nation desperate for Saudi oil. This new economic reality empowered India to speak boldly, reminding Riyadh that old leverage no longer works in the same way. By doing so, India signaled to Saudi Arabia that its traditional tools of pressure are losing effectiveness, and that India has entered an era where it engages with partners on equal footing, not as a subordinate. What truly shocked Saudi Arabia was the directness of India's words. In global politics, nations often wrap their disagreements in layers of diplomatic language, but India's reply stripped away all pretenses. It was honest, unflinching, and unapologetic. India reminded Saudi Arabia that while it respects the kingdom's importance in the Muslim world, it will not accept lectures or interference that undermine its unity, sovereignty, or global standing. This was not an attack, but a declaration of self-respect, one that surprised Riyadh because it had grown accustomed to other nations avoiding open confrontation with it. India's boldness showed that times have changed, and Saudi Arabia could no longer expect to dominate narratives without challenge. The reply also carried broader symbolism that extended beyond Saudi Arabia itself. It was a message to all nations that attempted to use influence, alliances, or economic ties to corner India. Saudi Arabia's miscalculation was assuming that India still saw itself as dependent on others for global acceptance. Instead, the reply demonstrated that India has already earned its place at the table of major power. The shock came not just from the content of India's words, but from the conviction behind them. It was the voice of a nation that has realized its strength and is unafraid to assert it, even against powers that once seemed untouchable. This moment also reflected the changing balance of global diplomacy. As India continues to build partnerships across the world, including with Western powers, Asian economies, and even African nations, it has greater flexibility than ever before. Saudi Arabia miscalculated by thinking that India needed its approval to maintain global influence. The bold reply proved the opposite. It is Saudi Arabia that now needs to recognize India's importance if it wants to remain relevant in the future balance of power. The shock in Riyadh was therefore not only about India's tone, but about the realization that the world's center of gravity is shifting, and India is at the heart of that shift. By boldly responding to Saudi Arabia, India has set a new precedent in its diplomatic playbook. It has shown that no nation, regardless of its wealth or influence, can expect to dominate India with outdated assumptions. Saudi Arabia's miscalculation was underestimating India's confidence, but the shock of the reply has forced it to reassess its strategy. India's voice is now too strong to be ignored, too firm to be swayed, and too important to be silent. India's bold reply to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia carried weight because it came from a position of undeniable global rise, a rise that the world can no longer overlook or underestimate. For decades, India was seen as a developing country struggling with poverty, internal challenges, and limited influence in shaping international affairs. But in 2025, India has emerged as one of the defining powers of the century, commanding respect not only because of its population size, but because of its achievements across economics, technology, diplomacy, and defense. This transformation is at the heart of why India's reply shocked its critics. It was not the voice of a reactive nation, but of a confident leader, ready to challenge hypocrisy and demand respect on the world stage. Economically, India is now one of the fastest growing major economies, consistently outpacing global averages even in times of uncertainty. Its robust GDP growth, thriving manufacturing sector, and dominance in the digital and IT industries have given it a level of influence that few nations can ignore. International investors look to India as a land of opportunity, while global corporations see it as an indispensable market. This economic strength has translated into diplomatic confidence, giving India the ability to stand tall and speak boldly, without fear of repercussion. When India replied sharply to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, it did so knowing that its economic partnerships with the West, Asia, and Africa provided with security and leverage that cannot be easily undermined. Militarily, India has also positioned itself as a formidable power, with one of the largest and most modernizing armies in the world, a powerful navy, and advanced missile and space programs. India's defense capabilities add credibility to its bold words. Unlike the India of the past, which was often seen as dependent on others for security, today's India is self-reliant, producing much of its defense equipment domestically and partnering strategically with global powers to enhance its reach. This military strength underpins its diplomatic voice, ensuring that when India speaks, it does so not as a vulnerable state, but as one fully capable of defending its interests. This balance of diplomacy and strength is central to its global rise and explains why its reply carried such shock value. Diplomatically, India has worked tirelessly to expand its influence across continents. It is a vital player in organizations like the G20, BRICS, and the Quad, and it continues to deepen partnerships with nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas. This web of alliances has given India a platform to project its voice far beyond South Asia. When India exposed Pakistan's terror politics and confronted Saudi Arabia's miscalculation, it did so with the backing of a global network that respects India's role in maintaining stability and promoting development. This diplomatic positioning ensures that India's words are not dismissed as regional rhetoric, but considered as part of global policymaking. India's global rise is also rooted in soft power. Its cultural influence through cinema, literature, yoga, and technology has given it a global identity that resonates with people across nations. The Indian diaspora, spread widely across the world, has become a source of pride and influence, strengthening India's connections with every major economy. This cultural reach adds another layer to its global presence, ensuring that when India speaks boldly, it is not just a government speaking, but a civilization with thousands of years of history asserting its place in the modern world. The bold reply that shocked Pakistan and Saudi Arabia was therefore a product of this new global identity. It was not an isolated statement, but the expression of a larger transformation. India's rise has redefined its voice, giving it the authority to confront powers that once tried to dictate terms. What made the reply so powerful was not only its content, but the undeniable fact that it reflected the confidence of a nation on the ascent. The global rise of India is no longer a prediction. It is a reality, and it is reshaping how the world listens when India speaks. When India delivered its bold reply, one of the strongest themes that emerged was the defense of its sovereignty, a principle that lies at the very core of the nation's identity. For years, India has tolerated unnecessary interference, unsolicited lectures, and unfounded accusations from nations that had no moral ground to speak on its internal matters. But the India of today has drawn a firm line, making it crystal clear that sovereignty is not negotiable, not debatable, and not subject to the pressures of external powers. This stance sent shockwaves through Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, as both had assumed they could influence India's policies or paint India into a corner through international platforms. The reply shattered those assumptions by declaring with confidence that India alone decides its course, and no other nation has the right to dictate its affairs. Pakistan, in particular, is built its narrative around trying to internationalize India's internal matters, especially regarding Kashmir. It has consistently attempted to interfere by portraying itself as a defender of rights, while its own record on democracy, minorities, and human rights remains abysmal. India's reply exposed this hypocrisy by firmly rejecting Pakistan's interference and reminding the world that the region of Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India beyond negotiation or compromise. This assertiveness stunned Pakistan because it left no space for debate or false narrative. By defending its sovereignty so boldly, India showed that it would no longer allow Pakistan to exploit international forums as platforms for propaganda. The firmness of these words was a signal that the days of ambiguity are gone, replaced by direct and unapologetic clarity. Saudi Arabia too was taken aback by India's unwavering defense of its sovereignty. For years, Riyadh had assumed that its influence in the Islamic world gave it the leverage to comment on issues involving India's Muslim community, believing India would tread carefully to avoid offending it. But India's reply made it clear that religion cannot be used as a diplomatic weapon against its sovereignty. India highlighted that it is a secular and democratic nation where citizens of all faiths have rights under its constitution, and that no external power has the authority to dictate how India manages its internal harmony. This response surprised Saudi Arabia because it was used to others, avoiding confrontation on such sensitive grounds. India, however, responded with directness, proving that defending sovereignty is not about avoiding offense, but about standing firm against manipulation. Defending sovereignty also carried a symbolic message for the rest of the world. It signaled that India is not just defending borders and internal policies, but the very principle that defines modern nationhood, the right to self-determination without external interference. In an era where powerful nations often attempt to impose their will on others through economic, political, or military pressure, India's boldness stood out as an example of true independence. This message resonated strongly because it highlighted India's role as a protector of national integrity, not only for itself but as an inspiration for other nations that face similar pressures. What amplified the shock was the tone of finality in India's defense of sovereignty. There was no diplomatic hedging, no conditional phrasing, and no attempt to soften the blow. The words carried the strength of conviction, showing that India's leadership has embraced the responsibility of defending its people and its identity without fear. For Pakistan, this was devastating because it left no room for its narrative of victimhood. For Saudi Arabia, it was surprising because it revealed that its influence has limits when it comes to India. For the rest of the world, it was a reminder that India's voice is now one of authority, not submission. The reply demonstrated that sovereignty is not merely a concept on paper for India, it is a lived reality defended with determination. Every word reflected the pride of a nation that refuses to compromise its independence, whether the pressure comes from neighboring adversaries or wealthy global players. By defending sovereignty so boldly, India established a new red line. Its internal matters are not up for debate, and its national dignity cannot be challenged without consequence. This powerful stance redefined the way the world looks at India and cemented its image as a nation that will always protect its sovereignty with unshakable resolve. India's bold reply to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia was not merely directed at those two nations. It was a message to the entire world, a declaration that the time has come to treat India as an equal partner and a rising power that demands respect. For far too long, India's voice was either ignored or downplayed on global platforms. Its concerns were often brushed aside, and its achievements were overshadowed by narratives shaped elsewhere. But the India of 2025 has turned that page, and the reply it gave was not just a defense, it was a statement of intent. It told the international community that India has arrived as a force that can no longer be sidelined, and anyone dealing with it must do so on the basis of equality, not superiority. The world is watching a transformation in the balance of power. And India's message was clear. Those who still look at India through the lens of the past are making a grave mistake. This reply, with its firmness and clarity, shattered the image of India as a silent observer and replaced it with the reality of a bold actor in global politics. The message was that India is not willing to be pressured into positions that do not align with its interests, nor will it accept biased judgments from powers that themselves operate with double standards. The shock felt by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia was only the beginning, because the real audience of this message was the international community that now has no choice but to reevaluate how it engages with India. The reply also carried a strong moral undertone. India reminded the world that it has always stood for peace, cooperation, and stability, but that these values cannot be mistaken for weakness. By exposing Pakistan's terror politics and rejecting Saudi Arabia's miscalculation, India demonstrated that morality is meaningless without strength, and strength is hollow without morality. This balance positioned India as a unique voice, one that represents not just national pride, but also a global responsibility. The message resonated beyond South Asia, inspiring smaller nations that struggle to make their voices heard in the global arena. India showed them that asserting sovereignty and demanding respect is not arrogance. It is a necessity for survival in a world where power dynamics often favor the loudest voice. Economically and strategically, the message was equally strong. India is now an indispensable part of global trade, a hub of technology, and a partner in security. The reply signaled to the world that engaging with India is not optional. It is essential. Nations that underestimate this reality risk being left behind in the new global order. The boldness of the reply forced the world to recognize that India is not a country seeking validation, but one offering partnership on equal terms. Whether it is in energy, climate change, defense cooperation, or digital innovation, India made it clear that it expects to be treated as a decision maker, not a follower. This was the essence of the message. The world must adapt to India's rise, not the other way around. Another critical aspect of the message was the exposure of hypocrisy. India reminded the world that it will not accept lectures from nations with questionable records, while ignoring its own achievements as the world's largest democracy. This was a direct challenge to selective morality, where some countries conveniently overlook their own flaws while pointing fingers at others. By calling this out, India placed itself in a unique position, one where its words carried the weight of truth and the courage of conviction. The message was unmistakable. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and India has earned it through progress, resilience, and consistency. Ultimately, the reply was a statement of confidence. It was India telling the world that the era of underestimating it is over. The message was not aggressive, but assertive. Not arrogant, but self-assured. It was the kind of message that left no ambiguity. India is here, India is strong, and India is ready to shape the future of global affairs. Those who wish to work with India will find a reliable partner, but those who attempt to undermine it will face a bold and uncompromising response. This was the message to the world, and it echoed far louder than Pakistan or Saudi Arabia expected, shaking assumptions everywhere about what India represents today.